Yes, thank you.
So just some general information to get us started today. There's a lot of folks that come together to make this happen. Doug and Dennis especially, but everyone in the region kind of gives their 2 cents to put this all together. Next call will be October 19th with Laura Edwards, the South Dakota State climatologist, and USDA's Brad Rippey taking the reins on that call. There's some links here to look at future webinars and also past webinars. So the agenda for today, I'm going to spend some time looking at the current and recent past conditions, looking at some of the regional impacts, the sectors that are being impacted. Going to spend some time on the new outlooks that just came out this morning, and then, like Doug said, we'll have some time at the end to go over questions. So one of the main topics that has come up since the last time this call took place was just the heat that had dominated the region at the end of August and into early September, and then what that did to drought conditions. So looking at the numbers from the National Center for Environmental Information, NCEI, the statewide temperature and precipitation rankings for August came out at the beginning of this month. And what we can see on the left-hand side is temperatures for the most part in the central and western part of the region were quite above normal. Colorado even with a top 10 ranking for their August. But then looking at precipitation too, we also see that there's some stark contrast in the region. We do see a lot of areas that were near average, but we also see the northern plains regions, top 10 wettest August on record in Missouri. Missouri had a few events that really skewed those numbers, but the upper Midwest, that Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even into Iowa region, that maintained an area of dryness that we've seen for the most part through the spring and summer. And when we look at the entire summer, so these are the same rankings for the period of June through August, and again from the National Centers for Environmental Information, we can see that for temperatures on the right, the northern states in the region definitely were above normal as far as their temperatures go, and their rankings show that. When you get into the eastern part of the region, though, you do see temperatures that were below normal through that Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky area, and then everything in between that was right near normal. So that's kind of a good summary of the summer. What this doesn't show you is the rapid swings we've had. That we had some very cool temperatures, some very hot temperatures, and everything in between. And so really a roller coaster for temperatures this summer. When we look at precipitation on the right-hand side, the state that stands out is Wyoming. They had their wettest summer on record. And we see Colorado wasn't too far behind, top 30 for their summer. And parts of Colorado actually did have their wettest summer. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But also look at Wisconsin and Minnesota. Top 5 driest with 129 years of record going back to 1895 on these statistics here. And then also on the eastern reaches of the region, not only did we see it cooler than normal, but also wetter than normal in some of those areas, which again, not too many impacts coming from that, but something that we are paying attention to. So looking at temperatures over the last 30 days, and this does pretty much cover that heat that we did see at the end of August and through that Labor Day weekend in the region. And when we start looking at temperatures in the Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, Minnesota area, you can see that these are, again, average temperatures. They were anywhere from 4 to 6 degrees above normal. And then even when you get into portions of Montana and North Dakota, you can see some of those departures from normal were even greater. And we did have some pockets in Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, even Kentucky and Missouri that were below normal during this time frame. And when we start looking at this and how it's starting to relate to what we're seeing on the ground, soil moisture is one of those indicators that really stands out. And this is looking at the percentile ranking of the soil moisture in the region. And the area I have circled it kind of stood out to me when I was looking at these numbers is not only are we seeing some of the driest soils in these regions, but it's been consistently dry in this area as well. And it's becoming problematic as far as impacts to the various sectors, which we'll talk about here later. We start looking at precipitation as well. We can see that this is just over the last 30 days. Again, we have the departure from normal, so how many inches from normal were received, and then also the percent of normal. And again, the region is really divided kind of from east to west. The western part of the region, really most areas were near normal to above normal as far as their precipitation. But the further west, the further east you go, especially in the upper Midwest through areas of eastern Kansas into Missouri, we can see that those departures 3 to 4 inches just over the last 30 days. So in essence, saying there was very little, if any, moisture from rainfall at all. And then when we look at the last 90 days, again, quite a similar picture where we can see the western reaches of the region really for the most part over the last 90 days. And again, going back to those rankings I just showed, we can see why some of these areas were ranked as some of their wetter summers. But western Nebraska, central to western South Dakota, and parts of Wyoming, anywhere from 3 to 6 inches above normal. Even some smaller pockets of areas that were even greater in that 6 to 9 inch range. And then the further east you go, again, areas of southern Minnesota and eastern Iowa really stand out. Portions of northern Montana and northern North Dakota, even into northern Minnesota. Some of these areas only 25 to 50% of normal, pretty much through the summer months, which again is one of the wetter times of the year for these regions. And again, I mentioned some of those storms that went through Missouri into western Kentucky and southern Illinois. You can see that bullseye over that region where a couple big events really led to that 150 to 200% of normal precipitation through there. And when we look at the calendar year as a whole, again, big changes from east to west as you go through the region. Most of the western portion of the region has been normal to above normal. And then you have this transition through the central part of the Dakotas into Nebraska and Kansas. And then to the east of that is where you really start seeing that dryness, anywhere from 9 to 12 inches below normal, even some 15-inch below normal readings in there. And again, some of these areas had been dry prior to that. So this calendar year moisture really has led to the drought development that we have seen through the region, and I'll touch on a little bit later. And again, we bring up temperatures. Again, the heat that we saw at the end of August and in the beginning of September is really what we've seen in various times throughout the summer. And just for the calendar year, I kind of drew this red line in here too, that if you're east of that red line, pretty much your temperatures for the calendar year have been above normal, and that 2 to 3 degrees above normal for the most part. And over that entire period of time, that's pretty significant. And then you start looking at areas like Colorado and Wyoming, where these temperatures are anywhere from 4 to 5, maybe even 6 degrees below normal. And so you can see that transition of again, where the weather patterns have set up and where that cooler air has kind of maintained itself is also correlating well to where we've seen the wetter conditions with these cooler temperatures through the summer months. So we're going to get into some of the regional impacts now, and one of the graphics I wanted to show right away, again, talking about that heat at the end of August, the High Plains Regional Climate Center put together this graphic of daily records that were broken or tied during this time frame. Not only were we looking at daily high temperatures, but also low maximum temperatures during this period as well, meaning that the overnight lows were not getting as cool as they should have, and set some records there. So you do see a lot of those blue triangles for those low maximum temperature records that were broken, and then the red triangles show where the high maximum temperatures were broken, again, just during this time frame. So some of the highlights from the regional impacts, and I do have this broken down by state, but I'm not going to go through everything that I I brought together for each state, but these were the highlights. Again, I've already talked about the late August, early September heat and how that impacted the region. And not only was this heat significant, but it also saw some very significant heat indices. I know that some outdoor activities with some of the high schools in the region were being canceled during this time. We've also heard quite a bit of West Nile outbreaks this year. And some of the areas we've heard it from were areas that were wetter than normal this summer, coming out of Colorado, but most recently, even out in the eastern areas of the region in Indiana, we've seen some West Nile reports coming in. Hail on the high plains, that's one that's really stood out. And not only did we see the number of hail days pretty significant for this summer, but the size of hail too. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit as we go through some of the state reports. The big one, of course, is the drought development through the region and drought persisting through the region. It seems like that in some of the area, July brought some reprieve to the dryness, and with the cooler temperatures did help for a while, but it seems like that precipitation has shut off until we start looking at what's supposed to be happening during the next 5 to 7 days during the outlook for some of the areas. Low flows on the major rivers, especially the Mississippi. We are seeing a lot of news reports coming out about barge traffic being impacted on the Mississippi River due to these low flows. So that's impacting how goods are coming up and down the river during harvest season. That's especially problematic. And also the size of the barges are being impacted, that the ones that are being allowed to get going on the river, they have certain restrictions because of those low flows. So a big economic impact with that shipping on the Mississippi being impacted by these low flows. What we've also seen with this heat and dryness here in September was this rapidly maturing crops as leading to early harvest activities. We typically see harvest kicking in this time of year, but even a couple weeks early, and the amount of harvest already being done, and that'll be shared a little bit later too. And one particular impact that came out of Kansas that I thought was interesting was just how drought and flood over the last couple of years has impacted the wildlife habitat in the state, to the point that they actually canceled their wild turkey hunting season this fall in Kansas to try to offset the losses that they've seen to those animals due to climatological issues over the last couple of years. So South Dakota and Wisconsin, a couple states here, a couple things from South Dakota I haven't mentioned were the lack of severe weather over the summer. Only 12 tornadoes reported compared to the average of 30. Again, that big hail, especially in the western areas of the Dakotas and the Black Hills. We've talked about the heat already. The one thing that came out with South Dakota was the flooding on the James River. I wasn't even aware of this until it was shared with me. But the James River went into flood stage in early April and spent 149 days there until finally on September 7th came out of flood stage, which was incredible considering how dry we'd seen it through the region. Wisconsin, some of the impacts were actually positive. The wine and fruit crops have done really well in the state. Those producers have been happy, especially those that could supplement some of the production with irrigation. A unique impact that we heard of from Wisconsin was thousands of freshwater clams being rescued, and groups asking folks to come out and help rescue these clams because of the drop in water table or water levels, that they have to push them into where water is available on the rivers. And again, drought is a big story in Wisconsin as well, but still no water restrictions in place. The Minnesota update, again, drought as part of the upper Midwest. 60% of the corn is mature and soil moisture levels are very inadequate at this time, so hoping for some recharge this fall. Just a tidbit that the Twin Cities have recorded below normal precipitation every month since March. But during that same time, there was this flooding rain event in Duluth on 9/11 with 3 to 6 inches of very localized rain. Brought all sorts of issues to the Duluth area, and I kind of captured off of Facebook what the Weather Service had shared from this event. In Kansas, I talked about the hunting season cancellation for turkeys. Again, the heat was again one of the big stories in Kansas, especially for the dates of August 19th through the 25th. And Manhattan reached 115 degrees that day, which was the hottest temperature for the country that day, and the hottest going back to 1960 for that location when that station was put in. And Concordia, Kansas, again, has temperatures that were reaching those of 1936. And for those that don't know, 1936 is typically the summer where most all of the temperature records in the Plain States were attained or set during that time. So to see heat in Concordia that was similar to what we saw in 1936, that is significant. Colorado, I talked about some of the West Nile already, and Northeast Colorado, the wettest water year on record and summer on record. But in the same token, Southern Colorado around Alamosa had the driest summer on record. So you can just see how short a distance it really was between those areas that were having significantly wet and significantly dry portions to their summer. A unique impact was the Pueblo chili yields coming out of Southern Colorado. Due to the growing conditions, that it really hampered what the yields were this year. Talked about the 10th hottest August already. And again, the hail numbers, just looking at some of these numbers, 796 severe hail reports, breaking the old record by over 200 events that was set back in 2018. And 15 reports of 4-inch hail. So if you think about how big a 4-inch hailstone is, that's just telling you the kind of hail that they've been dealing with in Colorado this summer. Indiana, again, rapidly drying and maturing crops has led to a lot of harvest. We see some soybeans being harvested on the photo here. Low populations of Japanese beetles, again, the high temperatures. One thing that was brought up was typically in the Indiana area, some late rains will really finish out those soybeans crops and add some yield. And with the dryness that we've seen during the soybean production cycle, it's really taken away some of that top yield. And so we may end up seeing some lower yields this year because those late rains didn't develop. And some of the concerns in this region is they're looking at possibly the third dry fall in a row with lack of recharge in the soils and water tables being a concern too. So as we look at things on the agricultural side, we're going to first start off with topsoil moisture. And this is the percent of the area that is short or very short, done by the weekly survey coming out of the National Ag Statistics Service. And so you can see the current amount. So for example, Iowa, we have 79% of the topsoil is deemed to be short or very short at this time. And what's really stands out is really outside of Wyoming and Michigan, almost the entire region is seeing some level of dryness on the topsoil. And when we compare that to the past decade or so, the red line on this graph is showing where we are currently. So approaching 60% of the region, or I guess this is for the US, excuse me. And for comparison, we look at 2022, where we were almost approaching 70% later in the fall. So what you're seeing is, again, these last couple of falls have really been quite dry throughout the US, and we are seeing in those soil moisture numbers. We talked a little bit about how crops were maturing. And again, we can see how much corn is mature right this time, getting ready for harvest. And the number to really look for is that number below. And that is showing the week-to-week change. So for example, in Illinois, 70% of the corn crop is mature, and that's a change of 28 percentage points from the week prior. And so you can really see that, again, these warm and dry conditions that we've seen over the last couple of weeks has brought this rapid maturing to crops in the region. And again, we are seeing some rapid harvest on these numbers, and you can see Kansas and Missouri again leading the way, as well as Kentucky with the weekly jumps below. Soybean progress, again, when soybeans start dropping leaves, it's getting close to harvest time. And again, you can see Illinois, Nebraska, North Dakota above 65%. And again, big changes from week to week where we've seen a lot of these soybeans changing in their production cycle. And this time of year, we start looking at how much winter wheat gets in the ground, especially in the high plains states. And again, anywhere from 29 to 34% through Colorado and South Dakota. And other states are again getting their wheat crops in. Pasture and rangeland conditions for the livestock producers, again, we can kind of draw a line from west to east on this map. Those areas that were cooler and wetter through the summer, they're kind of the greenish yellows on this map, not seeing any kind of pasture or rangeland issues in those states. But the further east and south you go, especially through Minnesota and Kansas and into Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri, we are seeing that pasture and rangeland conditions are getting worse. And that's problematic until those livestock producers can get these animals onto late fall and winter type of pasture and grazing lands. And just quickly, looking at crop and indemnities from RMA, again, we're seeing a lot of $1 million type indemnities for these counties throughout the region. And the further west you go, and especially in Kansas and parts of Colorado, those numbers do jump up into some higher crop insurance claims already for this year. Looking at the Missouri River, on the upper right of this graphic, what we can see is we are running pretty average on the Missouri River, and the forecast is looking to stay that way. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say on that slide is you know, Missouri's doing okay. The stream flow, the 28-day averages, I think this gives a good picture of where we are seeing some low flows to the region. Minnesota, Iowa, eastern Nebraska, most all of Kansas into Missouri, but even into central Illinois, into Indiana, you start seeing some of these low flow areas where, again, these longer term dry conditions are impacting the flows. And we start looking at the Mississippi River here, and we pick Cairo, Illinois out, kind of dividing the upper and the lower Mississippi. And there's kind of this benchmark on the flows at the stage, and that's on that lower chart on the left-hand side. And it looks like that we're going to continue to see this decline, that we're already below 10 feet at Cairo, and it's looking to be all the way down to approaching 5 foot, which again, this is going to be problematic. And some of these restrictions are noted on the table on the lower right, where not only are barges smaller, they got to reduce their speeds and just the amount that they can be carrying. So again, this economic impact of what's happening on the Mississippi River. But if you think about how the dryness has impacted the upper Missouri Basin through the upper Midwest, it's not too surprising that we're seeing some of these issues. We'll quickly go on to the drought update here. Today's U.S. Drought Monitor. Again, some of the worst drought that we're seeing in the region is still through Wisconsin and Minnesota, Iowa, into eastern and central Nebraska, eastern Kansas, western Missouri, and then some developing drought in northern Montana and North Dakotas, with some longer term drought in northwest Montana still ongoing. When I see the dryness to the south of us in Texas and Louisiana, knowing that a lot of the moisture that we receive into this region comes off the Gulf of Mexico, it does cause some concern of future drought development in our region as well. Looking at some national statistics with the drought, this week we are just under 32% of the country is in drought, and compared to last week we were just over 31, so a little bit of an increase. We do see just under 20% of the country in severe drought or worse. A year ago, we were at 41% of the country in drought, so a little bit, about a 10 percentage point, 10 to 11 point percentage improvement from last year, but it really, again, is where you're looking at that drought. And as of today's map, a little over 81 million people are being impacted by drought in the United States. As we look at the north central region as a whole, again, we can see that just under 40% of the region is in drought. 3 months ago, we were at 42%. A year ago, we were at 42, almost 43%. So we've stayed kind of steady as far as the drought in the region over the last year, but what has changed is that intensity. And we have seen more intense pockets of drought throughout the region developing over this last several months. And just looking at these changes on the drought monitor over the last 5 weeks, basically taking us back to the last time we had a call for this group, we can see that there are widespread 2-class changes in Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin, but some improvements in places like southeast Nebraska, far western Kansas, and portions of Montana as well. But a lot of status quo, I guess Michigan as well, with a couple 2-class improvement areas, but a lot of status quo. That means no change over the past 5 weeks in those areas that are in gray. So we either saw no change or worsening through much of the region over the last 5 weeks. And just looking at some new tools from the National Drought Mitigation Center, these are looking at short and long-term conditions on a composite drought index scale. And again, on the short term, that upper Midwest area really stands out on those indicators, and also that wetness that we've seen in the western part of our region. And on the long term, it really starts showing up in South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, parts of Kansas and Missouri, that we're dealing with both short and long-term drought issues in these regions, and even some lingering long-term dryness in portions of Indiana, which correlates well to the comments that I brought up earlier about, possibly 3 straight falls now where dryness has been prevalent.
Hey, Brian, quickly, what's the relative timeframes in short term versus long term in that graphic?
In these graphics here, short term is typically 4 months or less, and long term is 6 months or greater, out to 3 years actually.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. We'll go to the outlooks real quick. And what we have here is the hazards outlook, and the couple that stand out for our region: heavy rain and severe weather for pushing late September. We typically are not talking severe weather for the most part, but it looks like we have some good chances starting over the next couple days. But the heavy rain, I think that can bring a lot of initial relief. One thing to consider this time of year is soil moisture recharge. We really look at the fall season before freeze up starts. Any moisture precipitation that we get will get into that soil and start recharging that soil moisture. First at those top depths, and then as we get more to the deeper depths. And that's so vital going into the winter season, to have that moisture in the soil, not only before freeze up, but it's really the moisture that is available for that cropping season going into the next year. We've really missed out the last couple of years on substantial recharge in the soil. So anything that we can get, especially this early in the season, will go a long way. And this is the forecasted rainfall over the next 7 days, taking us through the 28th of September. And you can see in those purplish reds to purple, we're looking at 2 to 3 inches. In some of these areas, the blues are even in that inch to inch and a half range. So if this verifies, we're seeing a lot of Montana, the Dakotas, eastern and central Nebraska, much of Iowa, southern Minnesota, into Illinois and Missouri, eastern Kansas, seeing some significant moisture here over the next 7 days, which again, it looks like most all of the region should be experiencing some precipitation outside of western Kansas, Colorado, and southern Wyoming. So again, this really is good news. It may slow down some of the harvest activities that's taking place, but as dry as the soils are, I think that would be temporary. You start looking at the 8 to 14 day outlooks, and these are looking at temperatures on the left and precipitation on the right. So for the most part, temperature is showing us that we have above normal chances of experiencing above normal temperatures almost throughout the entire region, with a bullseye on the upper Midwest. So fairly warm conditions are going to be expected during this time. And that correlates with, again, some of the wetter than normal conditions. A lot of this is picking up on this wetter pattern that's going to start initiating here soon, but carrying on. This goes all the way through the October 4th timeframe, but also continued dryness again through the eastern part of the region. with the best chances of below normal precipitation in that Illinois to Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Western Kentucky area. And for the month of October, just again, we see this big circle of equal chances for temperatures that encompasses much of the region. And those that are not equal chances, we're seeing above normal chances of above normal temperatures during this time frame, with the eastern stretches being warmer during October. And with precipitation on the right, equal chances through much of the region. We do see some above normal chances of below normal precipitation in the Great Lakes region, and then portions of Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, and the eastern reaches of the region are showing that they have above normal chances of seeing above normal precipitation. One thing we do start seeing those monthly precipitation totals decline as we go into the fall. So even one or two rain events could easily push some of these areas into that above normal verification area. And as we look at the 3-month outlook, this is October, November, and December. Temperatures, we almost have the entire region seeing equal chances. So really not a strong signal one way or the other of above or below normal temperatures. A little bit of above normal chances in those Great Lakes areas. And precipitation is kind of the same way, equal chances. Some of the area is seeing some above normal chances of below normal precipitation through the Great Lakes and catching portions of Montana. And then that kind of takes us into our first kind of winter outlook. I will mention that next month's call, we will have the official NOAA winter outlook available at that time. So this is the preliminary one based off of the outlooks that were updated today. And what we're seeing here is a typical El Nino signal, which I'm going to talk about on some further slides, but above normal chances of above normal temperatures throughout the northern tier of the US, which is what we're seeing here, with a stronger signal on those Great Lakes and upper Midwest areas. And then we also see equal chances to this drier signal with the northern tier of the US. What that is saying is, again, there's above normal chances of below normal precipitation through the winter months. And again, we'll get this update with the official winter forecast that will come out in October and be talked about during the October call with Laura. So it does look like, El Nino is starting to set in. The winter months typically have the strongest signal associated with El Nino, which is the warming of the waters in the Pacific. And then it looks like, too, that we will go through this El Nino situation, but then late winter, early spring, it looks like we transition to neutral conditions pretty quickly as well. And so what does El Nino mean in this wintertime pattern? And again, I'm going to stress that this is the wintertime pattern. We typically will see warmer than normal conditions along the northern tier of the US, all the way through the Great Lakes. And then we do see this pocket of dryness through the Ohio River Valley to the Eastern Corn Belt, as I would call it. And pretty much if you go back to what this outlook looks like, you can really see that strong influence of El Nino through the winter months coming into play during the making of this outlook. The seasonal drought outlook, you see in the region here that anything in brown, basically drought is going to persist the way we see it now. The gray is showing that drought remains, but could see some improvement. So basically maybe some de-intensification of drought in those areas. In the green areas, that's showing that drought removal is likely. And this takes us all the way through the end of December during this time. It also shows that some of that improvement taking place to our south, which is kind of key. But we also see some further development in parts of Montana as well. So again, pretty strong signal to El Nino on what we're seeing with even the seasonal drought outlook. Quickly, last couple slides, we do look at the wildland fire potential with the warm and dry conditions we've seen over the last couple months and harvest taking place. A lot of equipment, a lot of vehicles out in these fields and grassy areas. So we really need to pay attention for agricultural harvest related fires. But this is also looking at wildland potential. Again, some of these areas that just did not green up over the summer months in the upper Midwest, we're seeing that increased above normal wildland fire potential through September and October both. And because we're close to that time of year, this is where we typically will see the first 32-degree freeze. And we can see that the end of September, northern Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, even parts in South Dakota, we will start seeing those potential for first freezes come up. But if you go back and look at those outlooks, it looked like we were going to be in a fairly warm pattern. So the idea of a warm freeze taking place, especially in those areas that typically see late September, early October freeze events, probably at least minimized through at least the end of the end of September right now. Again, additional information, these presentations are archived. All the different partners that come together, their links are provided here. And special thanks to these folks that come together each month to put this all together. My information, my phone number and email address at the bottom, and we will open it up for questions. Doug, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks for everybody who stayed on so far. Real quick, I just wanted to say Dennis Toddy from USDA is also on, and will hopefully answer some of the questions, especially on the ag side. So we don't have a lot of questions today, but I think there's a few things we could probably expand on a little bit. This very quickly, the El Nino situation is such that it is a at least moderate to strong version of that. And maybe to go back to that, go back to the other one. The forecast actually for December, January, February. We often talk about December, January, February as sort of the heart of the impact of the El Nino in North America. So these are some of the stronger percentages and probabilities of temperature and precipitation that you're going to see. And you know, it's warm and dry to the north and wet, and tends to be a little bit cooler along the Gulf Coast and sometimes back into the Southwest. But these are tendencies; they're not truths, if you will. So other things have happened. There's also some relationship to snow in the plains, in the high plains or plains, and in the Rockies, especially in the higher elevations, that are pretty a little more strong probability. So the northern Rockies, say down into northern Colorado, tend to have a little less snowpack. We'll see how that goes this year, if it's atypical, if you will, El Nino. There are a lot of things that can get in the way of an El Nino or the impact of El Nino. Other, let's say, climate indices, we call them, or teleconnections, or butterflies flapping their wings, that you know, we'll have a cold air outbreak, or you know, some other pattern will show up that will override, at least temporarily, sort of the El Nino pattern that we expect to see. So that can happen. Anyway, Dennis, I think you addressed the first question. Why don't you read it and answer it? You want to do that?
Yeah, the question was about the impact of the late season heat on yields, and it was a combination. The heat in September was an effect, but the heat in August was also another effect, where you had very high temperatures on top of crops that were running out of water. A lot of the crops in the central part of the Corn Belt, kind of Minnesota, Wisconsin, down to Missouri, parts of Illinois and Nebraska, were limping along without a whole lot of soil moisture this year. Some cool temperatures in July helped out, and some periodic rains. But by the time we hit August, the high temperatures put a lot of demand on the crop to try to use a lot of water, and it just wasn't there. So that's why we kind of shut the season down early. It's not, you still get yield from it, but you do lose some yield because the crop isn't able to go through all its phenological stages appropriately. And there's also some yield quality issues that often come along with that. So the question asked is the billion-dollar question right now. If you can forecast yield, you can market and do some different things. But right now, the question is up in the air as to how much yield loss there was, and that's still being determined. And we probably won't know for a good month or more until we start getting more of the crop in from the field and see what kind of it looks like.
I will add, Dennis, I saw a video on Twitter this morning that was a producer harvesting soybeans in central Nebraska. And the stand looked excellent, big plants, everything else, but the pods were empty. He was getting less than 10 bushels per acre on dryland soybeans because of the conditions that you just brought up.
And that probably, the effect on yield may be larger on soybean than on corn, because a lot of the yield is determined for corn by the end of July. There are still a few things that can happen, but things in August can affect soybeans. So what you're saying would make sense, that crops may look good, but what you get in the yield may not be as much as expected.
Okay, we'll keep going down the line here. Yeah, there are some. There was a question about storms moving more slowly and dropping more rain. Is that what's going on? And a comparison to Ian and Idalia, two of the major hurricanes that we've seen in the last couple of years that hit the U.S. I'm not aware of the speed in which I'm not aware of differences in speed lately, or if there's a tie to a changing climate or anything like that. But I will say that, and the fact that we have seen 24 hours rain, heavier deluges of 24-hour rainfall events. There definitely has been more of those, but that's more, the heavier rainfall events have more or less been accompanied by higher temperatures, which hold more water, and that more water can get wrung out, if you will, in a shorter period of time with some sort of triggering event like a cold front or something like that. So I'm not aware of slower moving. There are definitely times when we don't have a lot of what we call it flow aloft. In other words, not a lot of steering currents, jet stream currents pushing things through, if you will. And yeah, that can lead to sort of static or stationary rainfall events, certainly. And I don't know what contributed. I didn't study the Duluth rainfall event, for example. That is a big hill there that slopes down into the Lake Superior. So there's a couple different things. Not only is there a little bit of elevation, but there's a lake there, and that sometimes those conditions can anchor a storm system over a point, if you will, and dump incredible amounts of water in a short period of time. No doubt about it. Yeah, okay. So now we're commenting on the type of El Nino that we may be having here. And yeah, sure, there are people that like to bring up what they call a Mordecai El Nino. I'm not going to get into it because I'm not that kind of specialist. If we had an El Nino specialist, and Dennis or Brian want to comment on that, they can. I've heard that, but I will say this. I have heard that word used a lot lately, and there are some people who say that El Ninos and La Niñas, for that matter, are behaving somewhat differently than they used to in terms of impact across North America, and that may be true. Although I couldn't tell you how, except to say maybe even more variability in terms of and less predictability in terms of what the outcome is. I can guarantee you, though, the forecast that you saw Brian present here from the Climate Prediction Center were very much based on correlations over the last 30, 40 years and longer in terms of decent El Ninos, decent being moderate or strong. Okay, okay, another one probably for Dennis with 3 back-to-back dry fall seasons. Is there a risk of more yield loss for the next growing season with field live fallow? With the field live fallow, if the field lies fallow, I suppose is what it means.
I don't think there's any increased risk from a crop standpoint to multiple dry years in a row, because we can still get decent amounts of moisture and get some moisture back in the profile, and we can get moisture at appropriate times to help yields during the growing season next year. There's just lots of things that have to line up. Probably the effect of multiple dry seasons in a row is what we're seeing in the way of stream flows locally and on the Mississippi and on groundwater, because you have to get more rainfall to get soil moisture recharged, and then you can get back to groundwater refilling. I'm not a hydrologist, so there's multiple things that have to happen, but that's probably the bigger effect, is seeing deeper dryness and impacts on people who use well water or city water, depending on what their water source is. So certainly we need water back on the surface profile for all of these. We need lots of it. So that's why when we talk about drought alleviation or drought improvement, we just say we need lots of water and in multiple events so that it doesn't try to all come at one point.
Yeah, and Dennis, maybe you can expand a little bit on the fact that South Dakota had quite a variability in their spring wheat and I think even winter wheat harvests, because in one part of the state they had perfect, I call them perfect maybe conditions. In other parts of the state they didn't, and certainly in Kansas they did not. And maybe that's an example of how you can have going into spring, it can be relatively dry, but if you get the right timing on certain crops, right? Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, okay, are we comparing spring wheat and winter wheat then?
Well, any crop really, and timing of precipitation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, timing is, you always need water in some form for a crop to produce, either in the soil or rainfalls along the way or irrigation. Brian, lives in a state where they do an awful lot of irrigation. You need it in some form. You can time it and reduce the amount of loss along the way if you get it at the right time. So yes, and then there's multiple aspects like Doug was talking about. Kansas winter wheat. Winter wheat had a problem because it went in dry last fall, so it didn't get established well. Spring wheat in South Dakota did pretty well this year because conditions were appropriate for it. So and the conditions really are specific to the crop and the timing and those sorts of things. And I've wandered around enough about, so I'll stop there.
Yeah. And so basically, soil is your bank, and a lot of people can talk to speak to this. Is your bank for the longer season crops and such. And if you don't have the deeper soil moisture, which is a worry, is a concern in July and August, when it's usually a little drier and hotter and the demand is greater than the supply, you can be in trouble. I guess that's kind of the bottom line. Okay, last week of August had the really resilient heat dome that formed over the south and lower plains. What conditions led to the development and what factors contributed to the feedback loop that kept it in place? That's a fair question. Anybody wants to try that before I try that? I didn't think so. So what I would say is, if you thought it was hot in Kansas City, and Doug, I think you are from the Kansas City area, if you thought it was hot for that week or 10 days that we had, and it was, you should have been in Louisiana all summer, or other portions of the South where it never went away, if you will. It was it was exceedingly warm and dry, as Brian mentioned. I'll say this, those things happen almost every year where some portion of the U.S. gets stuck, if you will, under what you call a heat dome, or we can call a heat dome. And dry begets dry, and heat actually begets heat in some cases. We talked earlier about slow moving systems. Well, systems get stuck. And there's some theory about that in terms of climate change as well. However, I would say natural variability probably leads us to believe that it's going to happen somewhere, and someone's going to get stuck in most years under a heat dome and sort of, or a dry dome, or both, and suffer the consequences of that. I'm not saying that there's not a contribution from a changing climate. All I'm saying is that's not extremely unusual to see one of those somewhere or in some areas. Anything anybody wants to add to that? Okay. Yeah, here's a good one for either. Well, actually, this is probably a good one for you, Brian. How helpful is early snow that melts quickly to soil moisture recharge?
Yeah, that's a good question, and yeah, really, it can be a big contributing factor, because until that soil is frozen up, any moisture, liquid or frozen, that we get, that has the opportunity to get into the soil profile. And again, if you have an early season snow on top of soils that are still allowing that water to come in, it's even more beneficial, because it's going to typically melt a little bit slower than if you think of what rain infiltration would do. So definitely can play a big part in it, and very beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah.
And with what Brian showed for the winter with the El Nino, there is an increased chance of warmer. Maybe there is more of the area that doesn't freeze as deeply, and we could allow some refill of soil moisture during the winter time. That's not a guarantee by any stretch, but there's an outside chance, and it would be beneficial this year.
Yeah, yeah. And we generally don't have the huge, generally don't have as big of rainstorms in terms of intensity during this time of year either, if it does rain. So cross your fingers on that one. There's no guarantee. Okay, to add what Dennis is saying, southern areas, yeah, good point, Chip. Southern areas of this region, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, southern Missouri and such, really don't freeze up until much later, if at all, in the winter, so that moisture percolation can happen longer and recharge season longer than certainly places to the north where colder temperatures come earlier. And then finally, we didn't mention too much about the Canadian wildfire smoke. I don't think it's gone away, and I would say I would hate to say the fires are out, because I haven't read that yet. I bet they're not. Anybody?
As far as I know, the cooler temperatures have probably helped, yeah, but I don't think they're stopped by any stretch.
Okay. I know they'd moved south, or the biggest areas were further south than earlier this summer, where it threatened Yellowknife. That area is okay. I think there is a seasonal slowdown, if you will, or stoppage once it starts snowing and colder temperatures do come in. So, but I have seen air quality alerts across at least Minnesota over the last week, I'd say. So I don't think the smoke is gone, and I have seen hazy skies even down here in Kansas City. So I'm going to go out on the limb and say they're not done yet. And I don't know. I don't have a prediction when they'll be done officially. If you had made me guess, I'd say they should be done by October or November. All right. Anyone else? Oh, we got one more question. Uh-oh, we're out of my swim lane. Do you think this is a new normal with the wildfires? Well, it depends, Kurt, on if we're talking about in the U.S. or if we're talking about Canada. So we have seen an increase in the number and size of wildfires, definitely. in the U.S. And part of that was due to a lot of the dryness that we had across the West for several years in a row, and infestations of bugs, and lots of other reasons. All right. So new normal. I don't know what the new normal is. I'm not a fire specialist, so I'll let one of the other two. Brian, do you have any comment on that? Being a drought guy.
I mean, we always have a fire season, regardless if it's wet or dry. So we do see some more correlation during dry periods of enhancements to that fire season. A lot of it does come down to management, and a lot of it does come down to those fine fuel opportunities. So sometimes the areas that are impacted the most were previously very wet. You get a lot of that growth, and then all of a sudden the moisture shuts off and it dries out, and it just adds more fuel to the fire, so to speak, because it has a lot more to keep it going.
Yep. Well, thank you, Brian. I do want to mention this real quick. Sorry, the last 114 people on here. Next month, we will have a sort of roundup of agricultural yields and how well things went, if you will, from an ag point of view across the north central part of the U.S. That'll be given by Brad Rippey. Laura Edwards will kind of give the typical climate overview and summary. So we always do this in October. It's a little extra, and it'll be a little extra long. So tune in if you'd like, and we'll see where things are going. Oh, and the winter outlook and everything else. Tune in if you like, and we'll try to get to the bottom of all this information for you. So thank you very much. And thank you, Brian and Dennis, again. Have a good day.